0317. That is the exact time the transmission was intercepted. Not 0316, not 0318. The SAS signals operator logged the timestamp with the same precision he had applied to every contact report in 14 months of deployment across western Iraq. Because in this line of work, a single minute is not a rounding error. A single minute is the difference between a patrol that makes it back to base and a patrol that does not make it back at all. The voice on the other end was calm. That was the first thing that stood out. Not urgent, not agitated, calm. The kind of calm that belongs to a man who has done something like this before and knows exactly how it ends. The Arabic was clean, unhurried, spoken with the flat authority of someone issuing a statement of fact rather than an instruction. The signals operator did not need to wait for the translation. 6 words. That was all. You lot are already dead. What happened in the seconds after those words were transmitted is the reason this story exists. It is the reason British military instructors still walk into training rooms more than 15 years later, pull up a single map of a 200-meter corridor in Al-Anbar province, and ask a room full of candidates one question before they say anything else: what would you have done? The answer, it turns out, is not what most people expect. Western Iraq, in October 2006, was not a place that offered many certainties. The province of Al-Anbar had been the most violent stretch of ground in the entire theater for 3 consecutive years, a network of towns, supply routes, and desert corridors that coalition forces had attempted to control, pacify, and dominate with varying degrees of failure since 2003. By the autumn of 2006, the assessment coming out of senior American command was, at best, cautious. At worst, it was the kind of language that gets redacted before a report reaches a congressional briefing. The corridor the 6-man patrol had entered that night ran between 2 abandoned industrial structures on the western edge of a settlement that had changed hands 4 times in 18 months. It was approximately 200 meters long. Both ends fed into open ground. The walls on either side were concrete, old, pocked with previous engagement damage, high enough to eliminate any meaningful lateral movement. There were 3 natural firing positions covering the corridor, 1 elevated at the northern entry point, 1 ground level at the southern exit, and 1 concealed position in the collapsed section of the eastern wall, roughly 40 meters from the midpoint. The patrol had entered from the south. They were, by any conventional tactical assessment, in exactly the wrong place. The signals operator's voice was flat when he relayed the intercept to the patrol commander. That was procedure. Strip the emotion out of it. Deliver the information. Let the man on the ground make the call. What the signals operator could not strip out, and what he noted in his own after-action account, written 4 days later, was the timing. The transmission had been sent at 0317. The patrol had crossed the southern entry point at 0314, 3 minutes. That is how long it had taken the insurgent commander to confirm the patrol's position inside the corridor, make his call on the radio, and deliver his verdict. 3 minutes from entry to the moment, a man calmly announced, in a language the targets of that announcement were not supposed to understand, that the outcome had already been decided. The patrol commander processed this in approximately 4 seconds. Rescue was not an option. To reverse course meant crossing back through the southern entry point, the same ground-level firing position that now had a confirmed insurgent element. Moving backward through a known position of fire, in a corridor with no lateral cover, against a force that had already confirmed their location, was not a tactical choice. It was a burial instruction. There was one direction available: forward. 6 men, no air support overhead, no extraction helicopter on standby, no quick reaction force within actionable range, no route out except through whatever was waiting at the other end of 200 meters of concrete and darkness. The patrol commander did not relay a speech. He did not pause to deliver a moment of cinematic resolve. He gave 2 words to the 5 men positioned behind him, and those 2 words were the last communication the patrol would make with anyone outside that corridor for the next 23 minutes. What the insurgent commander transmitted at 0317 was intended as a statement of fact. By 0345, it had become one of the most precise pieces of unintentional irony in the documented history of special operations in Iraq. But that is the end of the story. And to understand the end, you have to understand everything that came before it. The 5 months that built the trap, the 3 reports that were ignored, the briefing room where an American officer decided that 6 men did not need air support for what he described, in writing, as a low-risk route clearance, and the 2 decades of selection, training, and accumulated operational experience that those 6 men carried into a 200-meter corridor in the middle of the night, with no way out. But forward. This is not a story about luck. It never was. There is a particular kind of story that military institutions prefer to keep inside their own walls. Not because the events are classified in any formal sense, though some of them are and remain so, but because the story, told in full, raises questions that institutions would rather not answer in public. Questions about decisions made in briefing rooms. Questions about reports that were written, submitted, reviewed, and then quietly set aside. Questions about the gap between what the official record says happened and what actually happened in a 200-meter concrete corridor at 3 in the morning in a province that was already, by any honest measure, beyond the point of comfortable management. This is one of those stories. It is the story of 6 men who walked into a position that every conventional military assessment would have classified as unsurvivable. Not as a theoretical scenario, not as a training exercise designed to test decision-making under pressure, but as an actual operational reality, in real time, with real consequences on both ends of it. 6 men, no external support, no viable exit route, and a force of more than 40 combatants who had spent weeks preparing the ground specifically for this moment. What happened next was not supposed to happen. That is not a dramatic flourish. It is the verbatim conclusion of the internal after-action review, produced in the weeks following the engagement. A document that spent considerable effort explaining, in the careful and qualified language that official military reviews tend to prefer, why the outcome recorded at 03:45 on that October morning was, statistically and tactically, not the outcome that should have occurred. The document ran to 61 pages. The engagement itself lasted 23 minutes. Understand clearly what was not available to those 6 men that night. There was no air support, not because the request had been overlooked in the chaos of a busy operational tempo, but because it had been formally denied 72 hours before the patrol departed. There was no extraction helicopter holding in a nearby orbit, ready to move on a contact report. There was no quick reaction force staged within a distance that would have made any difference to the timeline of what unfolded between 03:17 and 03:45. There was no surveillance asset overhead tracking the patrol's movement through the corridor, feeding real-time imagery to a tactical operations center where someone with authority could have intervened. There was nothing. 6 men, their weapons, their equipment, and everything that 22 weeks in the Brecon beacons and years of operational deployment had built into them. That was the complete inventory of what entered that corridor on the night of the engagement. It should not have been enough. The insurgent commander who transmitted at 03:17 had based his entire operational plan on the certainty that it was not enough. He was not guessing. He was not being reckless with the lives of the 40-plus men he had positioned in that corridor over the preceding weeks. He was drawing on 5 months of consistent, documented results. He had run this calculation before, against different patrols, with different compositions, and the arithmetic had never failed him. A fixed position of overwhelming numerical advantage, total coverage of all exit routes, the element of surprise, and a target force that had been denied the support assets that coalition doctrine considered minimum requirements for engagement in a contested urban corridor. The math was not close, and yet, what this story is not about needs to be stated plainly, because the absence of certain elements is as important as the presence of others. This is not a story about a fortunate outcome produced by circumstances that aligned in an unlikely way at the critical moment. There is no equipment malfunction on the insurgent side that tilted the engagement. There is no timely arrival of external support that changed the balance of force. There is no single act of individual heroism, dramatic and isolated, that can be extracted from the sequence of events and held up as the explanation for what happened. The after-action review looked for all of those things. It found none of them. What it found instead was something considerably harder to explain in the language that official military reviews tend to prefer, and considerably more unsettling for the institutions that had decided, 72 hours before the patrol departed, that 6 men did not require air support for what they had assessed as a low-risk route clearance. What the review found was that the outcome was not accidental. It was the product of something that had been built over years, assembled through a selection process that most candidates do not survive, refined through training cycles that operate on the edge of what the human body will tolerate, and tested across multiple previous deployments in conditions that would have ended most careers before they started. It was not luck that walked into that corridor. It was the accumulated result of a system designed specifically to produce men who could function at the outer limit of what any conventional assessment would consider possible. The insurgent commander had planned for a patrol. He had not planned for what he actually got. To understand the 23 minutes that followed the transmission at 0317, you have to understand what 5 months of unchallenged operation had done to his certainty, and what 2 decades of selection and training had done to the certainty of the 6 men who heard his voice and kept moving forward. Because one of those certainties was about to be tested for the first time, and the other had already been tested so many times that it no longer felt like certainty at all. It felt like something quieter than that, something closer to habit. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about what happens when the wrong people get sent into the right trap. His name does not appear in any declassified document. That is not unusual. The majority of insurgent commanders operating in Al-Anbar province during that period were identified in intelligence files by designations rather than names, a combination of operational security protocols and the practical reality that confirmed identification often came after the fact, during post-engagement analysis, when the question of what to call someone had become considerably less pressing than the question of what to do next. What the intelligence files do record, with the kind of specificity that comes from months of accumulated reporting across multiple collection streams, is what he had built in the 5 months preceding the October engagement, and what he had built was, by any objective measure, formidable. He had arrived in Al-Anbar in the late spring of 2006. The precise date is not documented. What is documented is that within 6 weeks of his arrival, the pattern of insurgent activity in the corridor sector shifted in a way that analysts flagged as a significant departure from previous behavior. Prior to his arrival, the cell operating in that area had been characterized in intelligence assessments as moderately active, tactically unsophisticated, and prone to the kind of operational errors that tend to accumulate when a network is under sustained pressure from multiple directions. After his arrival, the assessments changed, the language changed. The phrase that appears most consistently across the reporting from that period is a simple one: disciplined coordination. That phrase, in the context of Al-Anbar in 2006, meant something specific. In the 5 months between his arrival and the October engagement, the cell executed 11 ambushes against Allied patrols operating in or near the corridor sector. Not 11 attempted ambushes, 11 completed engagements, each one initiated from prepared positions, each one resulting in Allied casualties, none of them resulting in the loss of a single one of his own fighters. The record across those 11 engagements was not the product of luck or of unusually favorable circumstances. The intelligence analysis that examined the pattern in retrospect was unambiguous on this point. Each engagement showed clear evidence of prior reconnaissance, deliberate position preparation, and a command structure capable of managing multiple firing elements simultaneously without communication breakdowns at the critical moment. That last element, the communication, was what separated his operation from the majority of insurgent networks that coalition forces had encountered in the province. Most cells in Al-Anbar during that period suffered from a predictable vulnerability. The moment an engagement began, the command structure fractured. Individual fighters defaulted to individual decisions. Coordination collapsed under contact pressure. The engagements that coalition forces had the most success resolving quickly were almost always the ones where the insurgent command layer broke down in the first 60 seconds, leaving a collection of fighters acting without coherence rather than a tactical unit acting with purpose. His cell did not do that. The after-action reviews from 3 of the 11 prior engagements, the ones where sufficient Allied survivors existed to provide detailed accounts, noted the same characteristic across all 3. The firing positions held their discipline after first contact. They did not rush. They did not shift prematurely. They maintained their assigned sectors with a consistency that the analysts reviewing the accounts described, in one instance, as almost methodical. The word they did not use, but that the accounts implied, was professional. By October 2006, he had 43 fighters distributed across the Al-Anbar corridor sector, organized into 3 distinct elements aligned with the 3 prepared firing positions that had been constructed, reinforced, and maintained in the month since his arrival. The northern position, elevated, covering the entry point, held 14 men. The southern position, ground level, covering the exit, held 12. The eastern position, built into the collapsed section of the corridor wall at the midpoint, held 9 fighters with a direct sightline to the widest exposed section of the corridor floor. The remaining 8 operated as a mobile reserve, positioned outside the corridor perimeter and tasked with blocking any lateral movement should a target force attempt to breach the walls rather than navigate the corridor itself. These positions had not been assembled overnight. The northern firing point had been reinforced over a period of approximately 6 weeks, with materials moved in small quantities during periods of low coalition surveillance activity. The eastern position had required the controlled demolition of a section of wall that provided insufficient natural cover, a task completed in stages over 3 nights in late August to avoid the acoustic signature of a single large detonation. The southern ground-level position had been excavated to a depth that provided prone firing cover while remaining invisible to aerial imagery at standard surveillance altitudes. He had thought about all of it. The selection of the corridor itself had not been arbitrary. He had spent the better part of 2 weeks walking alternative routes before settling on this particular 200-meter stretch as the architecture for his operation. 200 meters of contained ground with high concrete walls on both sides, a northern elevation that dominated the entry point, and a southern position that covered the only viable exit. Anything that entered from the south was visible to the northern elevation before it reached the midpoint. Anything that attempted to exit from the north passed directly through the southern position's primary field of fire. The geometry was, in the literal sense of the word, a closed system. He was not building a trap, he was building a room with no doors. The 11 prior engagements had given him something beyond a record of operational success. They had given him something considerably more dangerous: certainty. Not the aggressive, brittle certainty of a man who has been lucky and mistakes luck for competence, but the quieter, more settled certainty of a man who has tested his system repeatedly against real conditions, adjusted it based on real results, and arrived at the conclusion that the variables he cannot control are outweighed by the variables he can. He knew what Allied patrols in that sector looked like. He knew their typical composition: 4 to 8 personnel, standard loadout, communication protocols that required regular check-ins with a tactical operations center. He knew their movement patterns, their tendency to favor the eastern side of the corridor floor when navigating in low visibility, and the approximate window between entry and the point at which a patrol would be fully committed and unable to execute a controlled withdrawal without crossing a prepared firing position. That window was 3 minutes. He had calculated it across multiple observations and found it consistent. He had built the timing of the transmission around that window. 3 minutes after the patrol crossed the southern entry point, when withdrawal meant crossing back through a confirmed firing position, and forward movement meant advancing toward the remaining 2. That was when he spoke. Not before. Not as a warning, not as a taunt, but as a precise operational statement delivered at the moment of maximum effect, when the arithmetic of the situation was at its most irreversible. You lot are already dead. It was, from his perspective, an accurate assessment. He had made the same assessment 11 times before. He had been right every time. The first report was submitted in August. It was not a speculative document. It was not the kind of preliminary intelligence assessment that gets produced early in a surveillance cycle, before the picture has developed enough to support firm conclusions, and that experienced analysts file with the understanding that it will require corroboration before anyone acts on it. It was a detailed, sourced, operationally specific report identifying a pattern of activity in the Al-Anbar corridor sector that represented a material change from the baseline established over the preceding 3 months. It described the construction activity at the northern firing position. It described the movement of materials into the sector in quantities inconsistent with civilian activity. It described a shift in the behavior of the cell operating in that area, the new discipline, the reduced communication signature, the evidence of command layer restructuring that the analysts had been tracking since late spring. The report was reviewed by the relevant American command element responsible for that sector. The review produced a single-line response in the routing record. Assessment noted, no action required at this time. The second report was submitted in September. By the time the second report was written, the picture had sharpened considerably. The surveillance had extended. The sourcing had deepened. The analysts who produced the second report had spent the intervening weeks cross-referencing the activity patterns in the corridor sector against the engagement records from the 11 prior ambushes. A cross-referencing exercise that produced a geographic and tactical correlation so consistent that the lead analyst later described it, in the internal review, as the clearest pre-engagement signature he had encountered in 14 months of work in that theater. The second report was longer than the first. It was more specific. It named the corridor explicitly. It described the firing position geometry in terms that left limited room for interpretive latitude. It recommended, in direct language, that the corridor be reclassified from low risk to high risk for patrol activity pending further assessment, and that any patrol tasked with operating in that sector be provided with minimum support assets consistent with a contested urban environment. The routing record for the second report contained 2 entries. The first acknowledged receipt. The second, added 4 days later, read, "Assessment reviewed, current risk classification maintained." The third report was submitted in late September, 11 days before the October engagement. The officer who wrote the third report had been in Al-Anbar for 7 months. He had written reports before that had been set aside. That was not unusual. And he understood the institutional dynamics well enough not to mistake a negative routing response for evidence that his work was being ignored carelessly. Reports got prioritized. Resources were finite. The command picture at any given moment involved competing assessments from dozens of collection streams across a province that was generating more intelligence traffic than any reasonable analytical apparatus could process without triage. He understood all of that. What he found more difficult to understand was the specific reasoning applied to his sector. The third report did not simply reiterate the previous 2. It incorporated the results of an additional surveillance cycle, added 3 new source reports corroborating the construction activity at the eastern wall position, and included a time sensitivity assessment arguing that the preparation timeline for the corridor position suggested an operational window opening within the following 30 days. It was, by the standards of the reporting he had produced over 7 months, the most complete and most urgent document he had put into the system. The routing record for the third report noted receipt. It noted review. It noted, in language that would later be quoted in full in the internal investigation, that the corridor sector had been assessed as consistent with routine insurgent activity and that the risk classification would remain unchanged pending further corroboration from independent collection assets. Independent collection assets were not redirected to the corridor sector. The risk classification was not changed. 72 hours before the patrol departed, the British element submitted a formal request for air support, specifically a rotary wing asset on standby within actionable range of the corridor sector for the duration of the patrol window. The request cited the 3 previous intelligence reports by reference number. It cited the engagement pattern across the 11 prior ambushes in the sector. It cited the time sensitivity assessment from the third report and the specific concern that a patrol operating in the corridor without overhead coverage would have no viable response option in the event of a prepared position engagement. The request was reviewed at the briefing held 72 hours before departure. The American officer presiding over that briefing was, by the documentation, a man with considerable experience. He had been in theater for 5 months. He had managed patrol operations across multiple sectors. He had sat in a significant number of briefing rooms and processed a significant number of requests for support assets in an operational environment where demand for those assets consistently outpaced availability. He read the British request. He reviewed the reference reports. He considered the corridor sector in the context of everything else on his operational picture that day. His response was recorded in the briefing minutes verbatim. 6 men don't need air support for a low-risk route clearance. The extraction helicopter was not placed on standby. The quick reaction force was not repositioned. The operational window assigned to the patrol was reduced from its planned duration to half that length, a scheduling adjustment that had the practical effect of narrowing the patrol's flexibility without providing any compensating resource. The patrol was briefed, equipped, and dispatched with exactly what it had been allocated before the request was submitted, which is to say, exactly what it would have had if the 3 reports had never been written, the correlation had never been identified, and the 11 prior ambushes had occurred in a completely different sector with no detectable pattern at all. The reports sat in the system. The corridor sat in the darkness. And in a tactical operations center that was not tracking the patrol's movement through the sector, nobody was watching the clock tick toward 0314 when 6 men crossed the southern entry point of a 200-meter stretch of ground that 3 separate intelligence documents had described in increasingly explicit terms as exactly the kind of place you did not want to be without someone watching from above. The insurgent commander had been right about many things. He had been right about the patrol composition. He had been right about the movement timing. He had been right about the absence of air support, because he had known, from his own observation of the operational patterns in that sector, that the support would not be there. He had watched long enough to understand the rhythm of how decisions got made on the other side of the wire, and the rhythm had told him what he needed to know. What it had not told him, what none of his 5 months of preparation had accounted for, was the specific identity of the 6 men walking toward him. That was the variable he had not considered. That was the only one that mattered. There is a mountain in South Wales called Pen y Fan. It is not a particularly large mountain by global standards, 886 meters at its highest point, accessible to recreational walkers on clear days, photographed regularly by tourists who have no particular relationship with what the ground around it has been used for over the past several decades. It sits in the Brecon Beacons, a stretch of upland terrain in the south of Wales, that is, depending on your perspective, either one of the most beautiful landscapes in Britain or one of the most reliably hostile operating environments that the human body can be asked to navigate under load in deteriorating weather conditions. Both things are true simultaneously. The SAS selection process has been using this terrain since the 1950s, and the reason is not scenic. The final phase of SAS selection, the phase known informally as endurance, and known in considerably less neutral terms by the candidates who attempt it, requires each individual to cover approximately 64 kilometers of that terrain, carrying a Bergen loaded to a minimum of 25 kilograms, plus weapon, plus water, plus full equipment. The route is not disclosed in advance. The time standard is not disclosed in advance. Candidates navigate alone. They are not supported. They do not receive encouragement, guidance, or any form of assistance from the directing staff who observe the exercise. They move, or they do not move, and the ones who do not move go home. Men have died on that route, not as a historical footnote, as a documented operational reality of a selection process that has never been redesigned around the principle of making it easier to pass. The directing staff who manage SAS selection are not indifferent to candidate welfare, but they operate from a foundational premise that the cost of passing someone who cannot perform under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress is higher than the cost of losing candidates who cannot meet the standard. The standard exists because the environments in which SAS operators are deployed do not make adjustments for physical limitation or psychological fragility. The corridor in Al-Anbar province was, by comparison, 200 meters long. Each of the 6 men who entered that corridor in October 2006 had passed that selection process. That sentence contains more information than it appears to on first reading, because passing SAS selection is not the beginning of an SAS operator's preparation. It is the conclusion of an evaluation process that determines whether a candidate is qualified to begin the actual training. What comes after selection is a continuation build phase, a period of instruction and assessment that covers close-quarters battle techniques, demolitions, signals, medical skills, language familiarization, vehicle handling, and a range of specialized capabilities that vary depending on the operational role the operator is being prepared for. The build phase is not a relaxation of the standards applied during selection. It is an extension of them into different domains. By the time an SAS operator reaches his first operational deployment, he has been in the pipeline for the better part of 2 years. By the time he reaches his second and third deployments, the level of experience that 5 of the 6 men in the October patrol had accumulated, the pipeline has been running for considerably longer than that. Skills that required conscious attention in the early training phases have become automatic. Decision-making processes that would have demanded deliberate cognitive effort have been compressed through repetition and stress inoculation into reflexes that operate faster than the conscious mind can track. The 6 men in the corridor had, between them, accumulated more than 40 years of post-selection operational experience. 4 of them had served in Afghanistan before Iraq. 3 had prior deployments in the Balkans. All 6 had completed multiple rotations in the Iraqi theater specifically, operating in urban environments that shared the fundamental geometric characteristics of the Al-Anbar corridor, contained ground, high walls, limited lateral movement, multiple simultaneous threat directions. They had trained for this. Not once, not as a theoretical exercise in a classroom, but repeatedly in environments constructed to replicate the specific stress conditions of close-quarters engagement in urban terrain, with live opposition, timed assessment, and the kind of immediate feedback that only comes from doing the thing rather than discussing it. The insurgent commander had built his system around a patrol. He had received something qualitatively different. There is a specific training principle embedded in SAS close-quarters battle doctrine that is relevant to understanding what happened in the corridor, and it is not a principle that appears in conventional infantry training at any level. It concerns the management of what instructors refer to as the decision cycle, the loop between perception, assessment, decision, and action that determines how quickly and accurately a trained individual can respond to a rapidly evolving tactical situation. In standard military training, the decision cycle is managed through communication. A soldier perceives a threat, reports it to a superior, receives an instruction, and acts. The loop involves multiple people and multiple steps. It has redundancy built into it, and the redundancy is valuable in most operational environments because it reduces the risk of individual error. In a 200-meter corridor, with firing positions at both ends and in the middle, the loop involving multiple people and multiple steps is not an asset. SAS CQB training compresses the decision cycle to the individual level. Each operator is trained to perceive, assess, and act within a time frame that does not include the intermediate step of communication with another human being, because in the environments where SAS operators typically function, the intermediate step is the interval in which people die. The compression is not natural. It is built through a training methodology that progressively reduces the time available for decision-making while simultaneously increasing the complexity and ambiguity of the stimulus, until the operator's response to a specific category of threat input becomes, for practical purposes, pre-cognitive. The body acts before the mind has finished forming the instruction. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of a neurological process that sports scientists, military psychologists, and combat medicine researchers have documented extensively. High-stress, repetitive training of sufficient volume and intensity produces measurable changes in the speed and reliability of the motor response chain. The SAS training pipeline is, among other things, a systematic program for producing those changes in the specific categories of response that close-quarters engagement requires. The 43 fighters in the corridor had trained to fight. The 6 men had trained to fight without thinking about it. That distinction does not sound significant until the moment when the first round is fired at less than 20 meters, and the interval between survival and the alternative is measured not in seconds, but in fractions of them. In that interval, the question of who wins is not determined by numbers or by the quality of the prepared positions or by 5 months of careful operational planning. It is determined by whose system is faster. And there is one more element that the insurgent commander's assessment had not incorporated. One variable that sat beneath all the training and experience and operational history, like a foundation that only becomes visible when everything above it is put under load. The 6 men in that corridor had been sent without air support, without extraction, without a quick reaction force, without any of the support infrastructure that the American officer in the briefing room had decided they did not need. They knew this. They had known it when they departed. They had walked into that corridor carrying the full knowledge that whatever happened in the next hour, the only resources available to manage it were the ones they had brought with them. For most military units, that knowledge would have been a weight. For these 6 men, it was a familiar condition. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, what they had been built for. 0317. The signals operator's relay was precise and brief. The transmission had been intercepted. The content had been translated. The patrol commander received the information in the same flat stripped register in which it had been delivered. 6 words, Arabic, directed at their position, from a source inside the corridor perimeter. He did not need to consult anyone. The assessment took approximately 4 seconds, and it was not a complex assessment. It was a geometric one. The southern entry point, the point through which the patrol had crossed at 0314, was now a confirmed insurgent position. To reverse course meant moving back through that point under fire, across open ground, with no lateral cover and no element of surprise. The walls on both sides of the corridor ran unbroken for the full 200 meters. There were no viable breach points that had not already been accounted for in the pre-patrol route assessment. The mobile reserve element positioned outside the perimeter existed specifically to cover lateral movement, which meant that any attempt to go over or through the walls would be moving toward the 8th component of a system that had been built to eliminate exactly that option. The geometry left one direction. The patrol commander did not communicate this conclusion to the 5 men behind him. He did not need to. The same assessment was available to all 6 of them simultaneously, and the 5 men behind him had been trained in the same pipeline, by the same methodology, to the same standard. They had arrived at the same conclusion in the same 4 seconds. What passed between them in that interval was not words. It was the specific, calibrated silence of 6 people who understand each other's decision-making well enough that language has become redundant. They moved forward. 0322. The first round was fired from the eastern wall position, the concealed placement built into the collapsed section of the corridor wall at the midpoint, approximately 40 meters ahead of the patrol's position at the moment of first contact. The distance to the firing point was less than 20 meters. At that range, in that corridor, with the geometry that had been prepared over the preceding months, the expectation built into the insurgent commander's operational plan was that first contact at the midpoint would be decisive. The eastern position had a direct sight line to the widest exposed section of the corridor floor. The northern elevation was covering the entry point behind the patrol. The southern ground-level position was covering the exit ahead. The first round was the signal for all 3 elements to initiate simultaneously. It was not what happened. Within 4 seconds of first contact, the patrol had disaggregated into 3 pairs. The movement was not reactive in the conventional sense. It was not a response to the incoming fire that required conscious decision and execution. It was the automatic output of a training system that had rehearsed this specific scenario in this specific geometry, enough times that the individual responses had been compressed below the threshold of deliberate thought. Each pair moved to a position that accomplished 2 simultaneous objectives. It removed the pair from the sightline of the firing position that had initiated contact, and it placed the pair in a location from which suppressive fire could be directed at one of the 3 prepared insurgent positions without interfering with the fields of fire managed by the other 2 pairs. The choreography of this took 4 seconds. No orders were given. No verbal communication of any kind passed between the 6 operators from the moment first contact was initiated. This was not a coincidence, and it was not a spontaneous collective decision made under pressure. It was the direct output of a training principle that the SAS has applied consistently in CQB preparation for decades. The principle that in a confined engagement at close range, any sound produced by the defending element that is not suppressive fire is information delivered to the opposing force. In a corridor 20 meters wide with concrete walls, a spoken order does not travel only to the person it is intended for. It travels to everyone. The insurgent commander's system had been built around the assumption that contact at the midpoint would produce a period of confusion, the natural, unavoidable interval between the initiation of surprise and the moment a target force begins to organize a coherent response. In most engagements, that interval was where the prepared position held its decisive advantage. The defenders were already organized. The targets were not yet organized. The gap between those two states was the operational window the prepared position existed to exploit. The gap lasted 4 seconds. What followed across the next 23 minutes does not lend itself to a linear account in the way that a conventional engagement might, where a narrative can be constructed around a sequence of discrete, separable events, with clear causal relationships between them. The engagement in the Al-Anbar corridor was not that kind of event. It was, in the language of the after-action review that later attempted to reconstruct it from the accounts of the 6 participants, a continuous, overlapping sequence of simultaneous tactical decisions executed at a pace that the review described as beyond the realistic documentation capacity of external observation. What the review was able to establish, from the accounts of all 6 operators, and from the physical evidence recovered from the corridor in the hours following the engagement, was a structural sequence that allowed the events to be understood, if not fully reconstructed. The eastern wall position, the one that had fired first, was neutralized within 90 seconds of first contact. The pair that had taken the suppression angle on that position had closed the distance to 11 meters during the initial movement phase, using the same collapsed wall section that had been built to conceal the insurgent firing point as cover for their own advance. At 11 meters, in a position with a sightline that the insurgent occupants had not accounted for in their preparation geometry, the outcome of the engagement with the eastern position was brief. The northern elevation was engaged simultaneously by the second pair from a position along the eastern wall that placed the elevation's primary firing angle at an oblique rather than a direct aspect. The tactical problem of an elevated firing position in a contained corridor is a specific one, and it is a problem that SAS CQB training addresses directly. The elevation advantage that makes a high position dominant in a conventional engagement becomes a geometric liability when the opposing element is close enough and low enough that the angle of depression required to engage them moves the firing point outside its prepared arc. The second pair understood this. They moved to the geometry that made the elevation a liability before the elevation element had recalibrated. The southern ground level position, the exit point, the position that covered the only forward route out of the corridor, was the last of the 3 to be resolved. It was also the most complex, because the southern position had the greatest depth of prepared cover and the clearest sightline to the corridor floor. The third pair's approach required a sequence of movements along the western wall that kept them inside the angular blind spot of the southern position's primary field of fire, while the other 2 pairs maintained suppressive pressure on the northern and residual eastern elements. During all of this, no communication with the Tactical Operations Center was attempted. No contact report was transmitted. No request for support was made. There was no support to request. The helicopter was not on standby. The quick reaction force was not staged, and the communications architecture that existed between the patrol and the command element was not designed for real-time management of a close-quarters engagement of this complexity. The 6 operators were, in every practical sense, operating as a closed system. What they knew from what they could see and hear within the corridor. What they decided in the fractions of seconds available between perception and action. The clock did not stop. 03:22 became 03:30 became 03:38. The corridor, which had been prepared over months to be a room with no doors, was becoming something else. 03:45. The corridor was silent. Not the operational silence of 6 men moving through a position without speaking. A different silence, heavier and more complete. the kind that settles over a confined space when the thing that had been filling it with noise and pressure and forward momentum has stopped. The concrete walls, which had channeled and compressed and reflected sound for 23 minutes, were absorbing it now. The temperature inside the corridor had not changed. The geometry had not changed. The 200 meters of contained ground that the insurgent commander had spent 5 months converting into a closed system was the same 200 meters it had always been. What was different was everything else. The patrol commander did a systematic check of the 5 men behind him. The check was not rapid or cursory. It was the deliberate, methodical assessment of a man who understood that the adrenaline architecture of close-quarters engagement is specifically designed by the human body to mask damage, and that the absence of visible injury in the immediate aftermath of a contact of that intensity was a data point that required verification rather than assumption. He moved through each of the 5 in sequence. He checked what needed to be checked. He noted what he found. What he found was 6 men who had been inside a prepared ambush for 23 minutes, against a force that outnumbered them by more than 7 to 1, in a contained environment with no external support and no viable exit route at the moment of first contact. All 6 were standing. The post-engagement clearance of the corridor took 40 minutes and was conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized the 23 minutes preceding it. This phase is not dramatic in the way that contact itself is dramatic. It is systematic, careful, and in many respects more cognitively demanding than the engagement, because it requires the transition from the compressed, precognitive decision-making state of active contact to the slower, more deliberate analytical mode of scene assessment. The body resists this transition. The neurological systems that were running at their operational ceiling 23 minutes ago do not power down cleanly or quickly. The training accounts for this. The clearance protocols that SAS operators apply in the post-contact phase are designed to function correctly, even when the people executing them are operating in the specific cognitive state that follows sustained close-quarters engagement. The clearance established the following. 34 combatants were dead inside the corridor perimeter. The distribution across the 3 prepared firing positions was consistent with the sequence of the engagement, as the 6 operators later reconstructed it. The eastern wall position had the highest concentration, reflecting the rapid neutralization of the first contact element in the initial phase. The northern elevation showed evidence of the oblique engagement approach that the second pair had executed, with the physical evidence confirming that the geometric repositioning had been as effective as the tactic required it to be. The southern ground-level position, the deepest and most heavily prepared of the 3, showed evidence of a more extended engagement, consistent with the complexity that the third pair had navigated in the final phase of the contact. Of the 43 fighters that the insurgent commander had distributed across the corridor system, 34 were inside the perimeter when the clearance was completed. The remaining 9, the mobile reserve element tasked with covering lateral movement outside the walls, had not entered the corridor during the engagement. The after-action review later assessed that the reserve element's failure to reinforce was consistent with the speed of the engagement. The contact had resolved faster than the reserve element's decision cycle had been able to process and respond to. 23 minutes was not long enough for them to decide what to do. It had been more than long enough for the 6 men inside. The identification of the insurgent commander was not completed that night. The post-contact clearance established the presence of the bodies. The identification process required the forensic and intelligence analysis work that followed in the hours and days after the patrol returned to base. The analysis was thorough. It was thorough because the intelligence picture that had been built across the preceding 5 months, the 3 reports, the 11 prior engagement records, the surveillance cycle documentation, provided a detailed baseline against which the physical evidence from the corridor could be cross-referenced. The conclusion of that cross-referencing was confirmed in the morning. The man who had arrived in Al-Anbar in the late spring of 2006 and spent 5 months building a system that had produced 11 consecutive successful ambushes without a single operational defeat. The man who had selected the corridor, designed the firing position, geometry, managed the construction of the northern elevation and the eastern wall placement, and the southern ground-level excavation, and who had transmitted 6 words at 0317 in the precise confidence of someone who had run this. calculation before and found it consistently reliable, was among the 34. He had been in the eastern wall position, the position that had fired first, the position that had been neutralized within 90 seconds of first contact. He had built the first room in the system himself. He had been inside it when it stopped working. There is a particular quality to outcomes that contradict every reasonable prior assessment, and it is not the quality that dramatic accounts of such events tend to reach for. It is not triumphant. It does not announce itself. The 6 men who walked out of the northern end of the Al-Anbar corridor in the early hours of that October morning did not do so with the kind of energy that the preceding 23 minutes might have suggested. They did what operators do after a contact that has resolved in their favor. They completed their clearance, confirmed their equipment status, established communication with the Tactical Operations Center that had not been tracking their position, reported the engagement, and began the process of returning to base. The Tactical Operations Center that received the contact report had not been anticipating it. The patrol had been classified as a low-risk route clearance. The report, when it came in, was processed initially as a possible data entry error. The casualty figures were inconsistent with the parameters of the mission as it had been classified and supported, which is to say, inconsistent with what should have been possible given everything the briefing room had decided those 6 men needed and did not need on the night they departed. The figures were not a data entry error. 34 dead, 0 British casualties, 23 minutes. The corridor that had been built as a room with no doors had turned out to have one door that its architect had not included in his design. It was the door that opened when you sent the wrong people into the trap. Or rather, from the insurgent commander's perspective, the door that had always been there and that he had simply, fatally, not known to account for. He had known what Allied patrols in that sector looked like. He had not known what was walking toward him on that particular night. That was the variable he had not considered. It was the only one that mattered. And by the time he understood the difference, the eastern wall position had already stopped being a firing point and had become something else entirely. The place where 5 months of careful, disciplined, systematically constructed certainty ran out of corridor. The internal review took 11 weeks to complete. That is a long time for a document that is, at its core, attempting to account for a 23-minute engagement. The length of the process was not a function of the complexity of the events inside the corridor. Those events, by the standards of what review boards are typically asked to reconstruct, were operationally straightforward, in the specific sense that the outcome was unambiguous and the physical evidence was comprehensive. 34 dead. 6 operators returned to base without a single evacuation for incapacitating injury. A corridor that had been prepared over 5 months as a closed system entered without air support, without extraction on standby, without a quick reaction force in range, and exited in 23 minutes, with a result that the review board's own statistical framework had no established category to contain. The length of the process was a function of everything that surrounded the 23 minutes. The 3 reports, the routing records, the briefing minutes, the single-line responses that had accumulated in the system between August and October while the corridor was being built, and the risk classification was being maintained, and the request for a rotary wing asset on standby was being denied on the grounds that 6 men did not need air support for a low-risk route clearance. The review did not struggle with what happened inside the corridor. It struggled with what happened before the patrol left. Consider the arithmetic of it plainly, because the arithmetic is the part that the careful language of official reviews tends to soften, and it should not be softened. 3 intelligence reports, submitted across a 10-week period, each one more specific, more sourced, and more urgent than the last. Each one reviewed, acknowledged, and set aside without a change to the risk classification of the corridor sector, or the support allocation for patrols operating within it. The cumulative content of those 3 reports described, with a precision that the post-engagement forensic analysis confirmed in almost every material detail, the exact position geometry, the approximate force composition, and the operational timeline of what the patrol encountered on the night of the engagement. The information existed in the system. It had been placed in the system by people whose job was to place it there, and whose professional assessment of its significance had been documented in writing and submitted through the correct channels at the correct intervals. The information did not reach the patrol in the form of support assets or a revised risk classification. It reached the patrol in the form of a signals intercept at 0317, translated in real time when the window for acting on it had already closed. 43 fighters against 6 operators, more than 7 to 1. Total coverage of all exit routes. Prepared positions reinforced over weeks. A commanding presence with 11 consecutive operational successes and 0 recorded defeats. No air support, no extraction, no quick reaction force. A corridor 200 meters long with no lateral egress and no viable route of withdrawal from the point of entry. 23 minutes. 34 dead. 0 British casualties. In the years following the October 2006 engagement, the corridor became a permanent fixture in SAS close quarters battle training. Not as a story, as a case study, with the map, the firing position geometry, the timeline, and the after-action reconstruction used as the analytical foundation for a training scenario that candidates work through before they are considered ready to operate in environments of comparable complexity. The specific elements of the engagement that the training focuses on are not the dramatic ones, not the transmission at 0317, not the 34 dead, not the 0 casualties. The training focuses on the 4 seconds, the interval between first contact and the moment the patrol had disaggregated into 3 pairs, identified all 3 firing positions, and initiated the suppressive sequence that determined the outcome of everything that followed. 4 seconds. The instructors who run the training scenario do not present those 4 seconds as exceptional. They present them as the expected output of the system, the result that the selection process and the training pipeline and the accumulated operational experience were specifically designed to produce. The point they are making is not that 6 unusually gifted individuals did something extraordinary in a corridor in Al-Anbar province in October 2006. The point is that the outcome was not about the individuals at all. It was about what had been built into them over years, through a process that exists precisely because the environments it prepares people for do not offer more than 4 seconds. The after-action review, in its final summary, used language that was more restrained than that. Official reviews tend toward restraint, but buried in the 61 pages, in a section that addressed the pre-mission intelligence processing failures and their operational consequences, there was a paragraph that had the specific quality of a document saying, in the careful register of institutional accountability, something that it would have preferred not to have to say at all. It noted that the outcome of the October engagement had validated, in the most direct terms available, the intelligence assessment that had been submitted and set aside on 3 separate occasions in the preceding 10 weeks. It noted that the support assets whose absence had been the subject of the denied British request had not, as the engagement demonstrated, been operationally determinative. And it noted, in language that was precise enough to be unambiguous and measured enough to be deniable, that the decision to maintain the low-risk classification of the corridor sector in the face of 3 escalating intelligence reports constituted a failure of analytical process that the review board was formally recommending for incorporation into command-level training on intelligence assessment protocols. The officer whose words appeared in the briefing minutes, 6 men don't need air support for a low-risk route clearance, was not named in the published summary. He was referenced by role designation. The recommendation regarding command-level training was noted in the routing record as received and under review. It stayed under review for a long time. The insurgent commander had transmitted 6 words at 0317 in the full confidence of a man who had done this before and knew how it ended. He was, in the most precise technical sense, correct in his assessment. A patrol of 6 men, unsupported, inside a 200-meter corridor with total coverage of all exit routes, should not have been able to produce the result recorded at 0345. His mathematics were sound. His preparation was thorough. His operational record supported every assumption he had built his plan around. What his 5 months of observation had not shown him, what it could not have shown him, because it was not visible from the outside, was the difference between the patrols he had studied and the men walking toward him on the night of October 2006. He had watched the rhythm of coalition operations in the sector. He had learned the patterns, the timings, the support architectures, the decision cycles. He had built a system calibrated precisely to what he had seen. He had not seen what 22 weeks in the Brecon beacons produces. He had not seen what happens to a decision cycle after years of operational deployment in environments designed to destroy it. He had not seen what 6 men look like when the thing they are walking into is not a deviation from their training, but the exact scenario their training was built around. He was right about the patrol. He was catastrophically wrong about the 6 men, 6 operators against 43 fighters. 3 prepared positions, 5 months of construction, 11 prior successes, 1 transmission at 03:17, 23 minutes, 34 dead. The numbers told the story. They always do.